good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today. And thank you for the introduction, Yoga. So today, I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that have already been talked about earlier. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mobile. I'm going to talk a little bit about people's attention spans, a little bit about sort of interacting with consumers and thinking about the impression that you leave on them. But ultimately, what I want to talk about is how research needs to change in order to sustain the quality, the energy, and the participation of the people that our industry relies on. So slightly different topic, but as I say, picking up on some of those key themes. I also want to talk about how we need to engage with people that take part in our research on their terms. And we need to fit the work that we do around consumers' lifestyles today. Ultimately, we need to stand in their shoes. So as Yoga just mentioned, I've just had my 10th year anniversary at Join the Dots, but I've actually been in research for around 15 years now. And back when I was a little bit younger, this is my hometown of Manchester. Actually, this is slightly longer ago than 15 years. Clearly, we weren't quite back in the black and white days then. You know, if you think about the good people of Manchester or indeed in Kuala Lumpur 15 years ago, people were quite happy to stand in the street and do a 30-minute in-street interview with us. They had time on their hands. They were quite happy to talk to us at length. So we were all right in those days. We could get away with doing a 30-minute in-street interview. But if you fast forward to the time-poor, mobile-obsessed, short attention spans of the consumers that we see today, we've got a number of different challenges to think about. So first of all, we need to widen the pool of people who are prepared to take part in market research. There's a lot of talk across the industry about declining response rates, about the difficulty of actually engaging people to take part and answer the questions that as businesses, that as agencies, we want to get the answers to help make better business decisions. Secondly, I think we all know that quality is increasingly an issue. You know, we want to make sure that we get the best quality participants and that we get the best quality responses from those people that we engage with when we're asking them to take part in our research. And linked to quality, there's also the question of energy. So we live in a world of distraction, and that's a theme that's recurred today. You know, we have a 9-second attention span, just like a goldfish. There are lots of things that are competing for consumers' attention these days. So we need to kind of maintain people's energy. We need to give them a reason to take part in our research. If we ever thought we still had a fully functioning participant after a 30-minute survey, we certainly don't today. So we need to rethink the way that we ask people to engage with us. So over the last 12 months or so, we've been working at Join the Dots on a solution which has kind of become our philosophy, really, about people-centered research. And in a nutshell, instead of expecting people to take part in research on our terms, so using our language, our techniques, and our question types, we've been trying to redesign our studies so that they better reflect the way that people want to engage with us rather than the other way around. So trying to fit what we do for consumers, for participants, for people, I guess to fit more naturally with the way that they would typically communicate with their lifestyles, with the devices that they're using, for example. And actually, it's not really that difficult to do. You simply have to stop thinking like a market researcher and start thinking about being a consumer, being a person, being a human, and putting yourself in the shoes of the people that you want to take part in the research. So there are kind of three key areas to this. The first is to think about the context. What is the context when somebody takes part in our market research? So where are they likely to be, and what else are they likely to be doing at the same time? They're not necessarily going to be giving their undivided attention to answering our questions about deodorant, for example. They may be multitasking, they may be multi-screening, they may be on the bus or on the train on the way to work. We need to think about that context and how that affects people. We also need to think about the content of the activity that we give people to take part in. So how can we make it interesting? Why should people want to take part in research if it's dull and if it's boring? How can we make it more engaging for people? And thirdly, we need to look at how we communicate with the audience. So how do people like to share their opinions and thoughts generally these days? You know, what else are they doing online? How do they talk to each other in their kind of natural environment when they're not taking part in research? How can we mirror that? How can we create questions that people enjoy answering? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share some of the practical examples of what we've been doing at Join the Dots and some of the experiments that we've been running to try and see how can we make our research more people-centred and what impact might that have on the responses that we get back. So if we start off with context, and this is thinking about where people are when they're taking part in our research and when they receive our invitations. And of course, it's very likely that people will be using a mobile phone. So increasingly, we are seeing, mobile phones across lots of different markets, but particularly in Asia, people taking part in online research using a mobile phone. So across all of our online communities, as about 2/3 of our business at Join the Dots is online qualitative communities. And I think the highest proportion of people taking part on a mobile or tablet on our communities is 80%. It varies hugely. So in some markets, with some demographics, it's much lower, around about 40%. But it actually goes up to around 80%. So we have to think mobile when we're designing questions and when we're designing surveys or other interactions for consumers. So we thought, well, why don't we build some tools that will work really well on a mobile to kind of capture that sort of audience? So we looked at what social media apps do and thought, how can we learn from what else is happening on the internet? So this tool that we've got is apparently based on Tinder. I don't know anything about Tinder, but for the purposes of research, I did have a quick look at it. So for those of you who don't know what Tinder is, so Tinder's like an online dating app, and the people come up onto the screen, you swipe left if you don't like them, and right if you do like them, apparently. As I say, I wouldn't know. So we designed a tool that kind of mirrors this behavior. And it's a great way of screening lots of different concepts, for example, and just getting a really quick, do you like this, do you not like this, which actually is the way that consumers think. We don't think in 5-point rating scales when we're thinking about people we might or might not want to date. It's do you like them or not? Yes, no. It can be a little bit brutal with something like Tinder, but actually that's how people think. That's how people go through life making decisions, is to think quickly and intuitively and not to sit there going, well, do I like them a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5? So we're just trying to mirror that behavior and that way that people actually make decisions in real life. But we do need to still do experiments to make sure that these types of questions do work better. So we did a study recently in the UK following the Brexit announcement last year. And we asked a bank of 10 different statements to consumers. We split the sample. So we had 400 people who did a more traditional kind of rating question on these statements. And we had 400 people who used this kind of Tinder swipe, yes, no. Sort of way of doing it. And what we found was that the average completion time was increased by 16%. And I guess we also looked at the work of John Poulston. So some of you may have come across his work. He's based in the UK. He does a lot of experiments on different types of questions and the quality of the data that you get back. And he's found with lots of his experiments too that actually asking binary questions, yes-no questions, gives much better quality data. And that's exactly what we found too with the ratings that we used. So that's a little bit about context and thinking about, how do people want to engage with what we're doing and what's the context of them making decisions and the way that they think. If we move on to think about content, and it's here really where we can have a much bigger impact on the quality of the information that we get back. So as I mentioned, about 2/3 of the work that we do at Join the Dots is online communities. And because of that, it's really important that we give people engaging tasks to take part in, because we want them to keep engaging with us. We want them to come back. If we give them tasks that are dull and boring, we're going to lose them. We're going to lose their engagement. They're not going to take part in our online communities. So we're using quite a lot of projective techniques, and this is an example of our journalist tool. where we get people to write a headline, we get them to write a short article, to tell us about an experience or to tell us about something that we've just shown them in terms of stimulus. There's lots of different applications for it. And, you know, we also use things like obituaries, we use deprivation techniques, we ask people to write letters to their younger selves, for example. These are all just different ways of asking questions creatively and engaging people in a different way than just asking a standard open question. Typically, these sorts of techniques give us about 2 or 3 times more in terms of the number of words that people will write, and a much richer use of language. You do have to be a little bit careful with some of these techniques that you don't overuse them, because some people will really love them, but they do use quite a bit of people's mental energy. So you have to kind of use them in the right context and not have a survey that's completely filled with these, for example, because it can be a little bit too much. So it's mixing and matching those questions. Okay, so here's another example, which is a sort of more of a quantitative approach. And this is our story builder tool. And this is where we ask people to answer multiple questions, but more in the form of a narrative rather than a sequence of different questions. And what you can see here is kind of going through, appreciate you probably can't read it, but effectively it's just asking people to kind of build up a story, and every time they answer a question, another question appears, and then when they get to the end of that story, it's easier for them to review the series of questions that they've just answered. They can change their responses if they want, and we'll typically ask an open question at that point as well to say, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about this experience or about, you know, what we've just been asking you? And again, typically we get much better quality open responses at that question, rather than just asking an open question after a series of standard closed questions. And when we did A/B testing against a standard open question, typically we get about 2.5 times more content by just doing it in this format and asking it in this way, so that they're able to review in context. We also get more themes explored, and we get proper sentences rather than just a couple of words. So if we go on to the third and final theme of people-centered research, and this is all about communication. And what we're really trying to do is make market research fit quite seamlessly into people's lives, and really understand, you know, if we put ourselves in their shoes, what are they doing, how are they communicating, how can we mirror that with the experiences that we ask them to take part in. So we looked at the types of things that people do in real life on their mobile devices, and we tried to replicate some of that in our research design. And as I've kind of alluded to already, people don't communicate in grids. So why are we communicating with people in grids? That's not how people think. That's not how people communicate. It would be very interesting if people did communicate in grids. I'm not sure what that would look like. But that's not how we speak to each other. So how can we mirror the language and the communication tools that people use in real life, rather than using something that's just not natural to them? It's just not something they're used to doing. So we took a cue from sites like TripAdvisor and from Amazon. And again, we get better data. When we ask people to give us a star rating for something and then write a review, we get better quality data. So going back to the Brexit survey that we did and the A/B testing to see which of these versions work better, we asked 400 people a traditional rating scale, you know, what's it like living in the UK post-Brexit on a 1 to 5 scale where blah, 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 blah. And then we said, imagine you're on TripAdvisor. Give living in post-Brexit UK a star rating. It's much more the way that people would communicate with each other in real life. But actually, it also generated much better quality data when we asked it in this way. So the average score that we got back, interestingly, was 3.3. So exactly the same mean score across both sets of data, but we actually saw more variation in the review format question, in the star reviews. And that better reflected the sentiment of the comments that we got coming through. So the written comments that people left, that variation in the data was much better explained by those comments that they left. And in terms of the comments, significantly more comments came through, significantly higher word count. So when we did the traditional boring grid question with an open, we got 5,000 comments from our 400 participants. When we asked it in the style of a review, we got 12,000 words versus 5,000 words. So a significant increase in the amount of words that people left in their comments, in the full sentences. We got a real richness in terms of the number of themes, in terms of the quality of the data, and overall, really successful to sort of tease out what was really going on and how people were really feeling. And what's really interesting about this as well is because you ask people to write a title of their review and give us a bit of a headline, they kind of tell a story in themselves as well. So, the show must go on, divided and torn apart. You're asking them to almost kind of think quite differently about their own opinions. And these are the sorts of comments that we wouldn't necessarily have got back if we just asked that in the form of a standard open question. So these can kind of tell you a little bit of a story in themselves in a similar way to the journalist tool that I showed you earlier. So we've also taken a leaf out of Twitter as well. We looked at, what else can we learn from? And we thought, let's try Twitter and see if we can take something from there. And we found that kind of counterintuitively, by asking people to do less, so by giving them a count limit and saying, in a maximum of 140 characters, people actually write more. So they've got that kind of psychological anchor of, I can't go above that, and they'll try and fit things in. Rather than just giving them a standard open question, they will write significantly more if you give them that limit. So again, on the Brexit survey, we asked how people felt about the vote. Half of them responded in the form of a tweet, half of them standard open question. Firstly, we got a 33% increase in the average number of words that people wrote. But more importantly, we got a wider representation across the sample of people's views. So only 4% of people gave a one-word answer in the form of a tweet versus almost a third of people giving us a one-word answer when we just asked a standard open question. So again, we're just getting people to think a little bit differently, be a little bit creative about the way that we ask questions and better engage people. So we're getting better quality data. They're more interested in answering these kinds of questions than just the sort of standard survey questions. What it did mean, actually, it's worth mentioning, is if you ask a standard open at this point, you will get some people really going to town, particularly with something very emotive like the Brexit thing, which as we saw, divided and torn, and kind of the country was a little bit divided and torn, and probably still is, to be honest with you. And you will get people, if you give them a standard open question, who've got a very strong opinion either way, who will give you quite a lot of data. And by limiting that into a tweet format, 140 characters, you are restricting, so you won't get some of those outliers, effectively, the ones with the very strong opinions giving you a kind of essay format. But actually, from our perspective, getting that range across the sample and getting the range of views from lots of different people work better, particularly in this instance. But it does depend on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to canvass the views of people with more extreme views and really get a depth of understanding from them, maybe the tweet format isn't quite the right one. So again, it's about understanding what's the context, what am I trying to achieve, and when is it appropriate to use some of these different tools. The last example that I want to share with you is a bit of an experiment that we're doing with emojis. So you might have seen, I know one of my colleagues has been talking at SMR recently about using emojis in research, and it's something that we're actually very interested in. I'll be honest, we haven't completely nailed this yet. There's still quite a lot of work to do, but we're just trying to do some experiments to see how can we use emojis. It's the fastest growing language in the world, apparently, at the moment, is the language of emojis. So how can we use that in research, and what can it tell us? And as I say, we've not quite figured it all out, because there are some key differences across cultures, within cultures, about what different emojis mean and the use of different emojis within different markets. But what we did here was, with the Brexit survey again, so we've got our own standard set of emojis, which kind of negates a little bit the fact that people have different versions on different operating systems. For example, we've got our own set, so at least we've got a consistent set. But we asked people to plot their emotional journey across the referendum around the time of Brexit. And this is what we got back. And you kind of go, oh my God, what's that? So what we could do here is we could just look at counts, for example, and we could count the number of crying face emojis or, heart emojis or smiley emojis or sad emojis, for example. There's probably lots of different ways, and we haven't quite figured out exactly what do we need to do with this. But this gives us some ideas of different themes at different points in time and different general emotions that people are feeling. As I said, there's still quite a lot of work to do to understand what exactly do emojis mean to people and how are people using them and how does that vary. But as I say, given that this is one of the fastest growing languages in the world and people increasingly are using emojis, it is probably something we need to be thinking about as an industry and saying, well, how can we kind of tap into this language? And while we're thinking about language, I think another thing I would say in terms of this idea of communication is we need to stop and drop this idea of using the pseudo-scientific language of market research in the 1950s. People don't think about purchasing to a particular frequency. Like, people don't speak like that. The BBC doesn't speak like that. Brands don't communicate with customers in that way. We need to mirror the language that people actually use in their day-to-day lives when they're communicating with friends, with family, with whoever it is, and stop using antiquated words or antiquated ways of phrasing things, which actually also helps because if you're then putting things on a mobile, you can usually write things considerably shorter by just writing it as a kind of normal sentence rather than kind of pontificating with lots of big words that people probably don't really use. Okay, sorry, rant over. So hopefully you've found this interesting and like I do, feel a bit of a sense of hope that actually there is some change going on in the industry at the moment, and there is a big opportunity for us to kind of think a little bit differently about the research that we're doing, and leave behind some of the language and the tools and the disciplines that the industry has been kind of clinging on to for the last 50 years or so, because everybody benefits from a more people-centered approach. So clients benefit from this because ultimately they get better quality data and better quality insight as a result because we're getting more information from their target consumers. Agencies have a better time designing the questions. It's much more fun, it's much more interesting. We can be more creative about the way that we engage with people. So it's better from an agency perspective as well. And participants enjoy the studies much more as well. So when we go back to doing the A/B testing, we found that we had an uplift of 23 percentage points in terms of people saying that they enjoyed taking part in the survey that had the Tinder swipe things in and the story builder and things like that. They much more enjoy taking part in that type of research. There is a little word of caution. We saw a decrease in the proportion saying that it was easy to complete. So while there are certainly some questions that are easier for people, the swiping, for example, and it's more engaging, we are actually making them work much harder when it comes to things like the open questions. We're getting them to really think about their responses. So it's not surprising that you kind of see that. But what that does say is that we need to be careful about not overusing some of these techniques, not having a full 10-minute survey that's just full of creative, crazy open questions that are really taxing for people, but actually understanding what's the objective, what's the most appropriate type of question to use, and how can we make sure that we maintain that momentum and that engagement from our participants right to the end of the survey. So while we've still got quite a lot to learn, I think particularly, as I said, on things like the emojis, and there's certainly some more experimentation that we're doing with different types of questions at Join the Dots, I'd really urge you all to think about research in a more people-centered way. I'd like you to think more about the context of what people are doing when we're speaking to them, to think about the content that we serve to them, and to think about the way that we communicate with them and the way that we share information, the language that we use, the tools and techniques, or in short, to make an effort to stand in their shoes. Thank you very much.